Assalamu alaikum. This screencast is brought to you by Prophetic Principles, Personal Development the Prophetic Way. For more information and materials, please visit our website at www.propheticprinciples.com. My name is Abu Dawood. This screencast is the second of a three-part series on how to motivate our children to read the Quran. In this part, I'll be introducing the three sources of motivation. The first type of motivation is what I am coining inherent motivation. Motivation that is part of our fitrah, part of our being human. Allah has programmed into us the motivation to do certain things. For example, we are inherently driven to act in ways that ensure our survival. We have an inherent desire for intimacy. We are inherently motivated to seek nourishment. So this type of motivation can also be seen as a reflection of the animal nature in us. And the Sharia, it recognizes and honors this level of motivation by establishing parameters around them. For example, we are allowed to act in ways that ensure our survival, but we aren't supposed to hit a person's face. Or, for example, during war, non-combatants cannot be harmed. Similarly, we are allowed to engage in intimacy, but only with our spouse. We are also allowed to seek nourishment, but only from the halal and the tayyib. So inherent motivation is one level of motivation. It is one source of motivation from which we derive motivation, but it doesn't really relate to reading the Quran or developing one's connection with the Quran in general. Being motivated to read the Quran for most of us, I think, is not built into our fitrah, but rather it is something that is acquired. Okay, so this is one level of motivation, but there's a higher level of motivation, and that is called extrinsic motivation. Now, extrinsic motivation is based on the idea that rewards and punishments are used to motivate people to perform or refrain from some act. In other words, it makes use of what we call the carrot and stick approach, where you reward someone with a carrot for compliance and punish someone with a stick for disobedience. Now, the characteristic of extrinsic motivation is that the motivation to do an activity is extrinsic to that activity. In other words, the motivation to do an activity is not derived from the activity itself, but rather from some benefit or harm that is external to it. For example, an allowance that we give to our children for throwing out the garbage or cleaning out their rooms would be a type of extrinsic motivation, because you're using reward to motivate your children to undertake some activity. Or punishing a child for not eating everything on the dinner plate would also be a type of extrinsic motivation. We have all been experienced or exposed to extrinsic motivation. The world runs on extrinsic motivation. And studies have shown that extrinsic motivation, it works. Extrinsic motivation works in certain circumstances, specifically relating to tasks and activities that are mechanical, routine, repetitive. And it also works in instances where you would want to motivate someone who is indecisive about taking action. For example, the car salesman might throw in some extra value, such as an iPad, to get you to purchase the car. So extrinsic motivation, it has a role and it has a place. However, extrinsic motivation also has some problems. So there has been some research done to show that extrinsic motivation is also inappropriate in certain circumstances. The problem with extrinsic motivation is that when it is used to get a person to perform some task, it gives the impression that that task is not something that one would normally enjoy or want to do. Because if it was, then no extrinsic motivation would be required to get someone to do it. So the effect is that it can turn play into work. And consequently, when one treats an activity as work rather than play, it reduces one's performance in that task. Now, in the book I mentioned in part 1, Drive by Daniel Pink, he talks about a study, and I don't have the time to go through the details of that whole study, but there were a cohort of individuals, and each individual had to solve a problem. It was the same problem that each individual had to solve. So these group of individuals were divided into two groups. One group of individuals were offered compensation for solving the problem, while the other group was not given any compensation to solve the problem. The study showed that the group that was not extrinsically motivated, in other words, the group that was not given any compensation to solve the problem, performed better than the group that did receive compensation, that was extrinsically motivated. And what the researchers found was that the thinking ability and capacity of individuals in the externally motivated group was narrower, meaning they weren't as good at thinking outside the box, and shallower, meaning that they couldn't think deeply or with depth, or what in Arabic we call basira, insight. And the explanation for this observation was that the extrinsically motivated group was more focused on the compensation rather than the problem. So the task of solving the problem was simply seen as a means to achieving the compensation. And so they tried to find the quickest, cheapest, easiest way to solve the problem so that they could get their reward, so that they could get their compensation. On the other hand, the extrinsically motivated group, the not extrinsically motivated group, saw the task of solving the problem as the ends, and therefore they performed better. So the conclusion of this study and other similar studies was that extrinsic motivation doesn't work with tasks that require thought, creativity, problem solving, ingenuity, innovation, and in fact, extrinsic motivation can actually reduce performance. Now, if we look at how most of us teach the Quran to our children, we use extrinsic motivation. So if the child is not reading properly, or if he's not paying attention, teachers respond with anger, and sometimes even with physical action. So the child is being taught to read the Quran. Why? Why is he taught to read the Quran? He's being taught to read the Quran to avoid punishment. On the other hand, the child is encouraged to read the Quran through being offered some enticing compensation, such as time to play some video game or ice cream, whatever. So what this is teaching the child is that the Quran has no value in of itself, that the value in reading the Quran is simply in the reward or punishment connected to it. So the fact that our children are being extrinsically motivated to read the Quran provides a key insight into why perhaps that connection with the Quran isn't being sustained. Now, there is a third, higher level of motivation which addresses the concerns with extrinsic motivation, and that is called intrinsic motivation, meaning that the motivation to do an activity is intrinsic to the activity. In other words, we do the activity because the activity is enjoyable, stimulating, pleasurable in of itself. So for example, many of us love sports. I like hockey, being a Canadian, and I can watch hockey and play hockey without anybody giving me an incentive to do so. In fact, people who love hockey will pay to watch hockey or to purchase the equipment or to buy tickets. Why? Because the motivation to play hockey is intrinsic to the sport of hockey. Similarly, if you give a child a jigsaw puzzle, the child will put together the jigsaw puzzle without any need for extrinsic motivation. Why? Because the task of putting together the jigsaw puzzle is enjoyable. There's a challenge and there's a pleasure derived from putting together the jigsaw puzzle. Similarly, the real motivation to read the Quran should be intrinsic to the act of reading. That a person enjoys reading the Quran, the child feels contentment and peace and pleasure through reading the Quran. That is why a person should be motivated to recite the Quran, not because of some reward or punishment connected to the Quran. So, now, there are extrinsic virtues connected to reading the Quran, such as protection and elevation on the Day of Judgment. And I'm not denying the reality of extrinsic motivation in Islam. We call them virtues or fada'il. And they have their place, and they can be used to motivate children to read the Quran as an initial boost or even as a supplement. But intrinsic motivation is more sustainable and powerful, and it should be the primary source of motivation for reading the Quran. Now, in part 3 of this screencast, inshallah, I will talk about how to get a child to recognize the intrinsic motivation to read the Quran. So I'll see you there in part 3, inshallah. Wassalamu alaikum.